So what happens when you take a bunch of engineers and put them at the bottom? You make their job obsolete. Now they're working with people that were recently way below their pay. So now when you diminish their value, their psychology changes over time. Some might lose their mind because they can't cope with transition. That means integration into another lifestyle, and that's not possible for everybody when they put blood, sweat, and tears into their effort over years, sometimes decades. And now when this happens, we lower the value of those people, and it, like I said, it affects their psychology. I've been wondering for months now what was nagging me about the Library of Alexandria. I've heard it a few times over my life, but this time it stuck, and I couldn't shake it. And I'm thinking, the more people that are educated, the more we realize, right? But we added distraction. They didn't have as many distractions back then. They would have been more primal distractions like gladiators and stuff like that. It wouldn't have been so much the sneaky. It would have been, they would have done a lot of illegal stuff behind closed doors, but, that's just how we are. Because at a biological level, why do we crave dopamine so much? Because our ancestors hardly ever had it. And now, since it was passed down through, genes, because we are a species, like we're categorized from every other creature on the planet. So, since our ancestors didn't get much dopamine, their brain would have really craved it anytime they got it. Which is why alcohol is such a popular thing, and meth, because the person, they get high on it and everything seems to make sense. The people they didn't talk to before, now they make sense. They make sense to them, and vice versa, so then they get this connection that feels real, but it depends on the drug. They were originally using it to make super soldiers that could stay awake for days, and we have a craving for dopamine. So, and dopamine is one way you can determine a person's patterns. Their patterns, a lot of them are based on the dopamine they like and how much they need of it, And so then you end up adding materialism, because we're creatures that get bored and we need competition, right? Because if everybody in the group is equal, right, you're going to have all these people looking at the other person saying, well, I don't do that, they're lower than me. That's what's going on in their head. So competition is inevitable in order to sort of physically prove that one is superior to the other. I think of it as power. I was thinking of this today. Power is not abstract. It's a possession that's given and taken. When we have power, it takes us over psychologically. You stop thinking about consequences and you crave that dopamine. And it's just part of our complexity. So then you add women to the mix, and well, what's the main problem with women? They love the bad boys, right? So when they get with a guy and they get married, and then over time, the woman sees the guy conform, and I mean, imagine Eve looking at Adam like, are you really going to listen to him? Bite that damn apple. I'm telling you right now, because you're going to fall into what I want you to be. I'm going to stop that conformity because I want excitement. Why? Because I deal with more pain than you do. I deal with bleeding, I deal with being physically inferior, potential-wise. I'm not saying women are all inferior physically. What I'm saying is that our potential, men, no matter how much women lift, the man is going to be able to get more muscle. That's all I'm saying. So, since this happens, I see this oppression activating a survival mode in women, craving that dopamine in order to not feel inferior, to not feel insecure, because what is insecurity other than inferiority? It's the illusion that you're inferior. But where we may be inferior in one degree, we might not be in another degree, so we need to let that person know we're not inferior in every way. So when you add that to the mix, women are the real driver for what men become. But then when you add cameras, it has the opposite effect, right? It has more of the conforming effect, especially since you hear people say, well, you don't do anything wrong, you ain't got nothing to worry about when it comes to the cameras. And it's like, with them, it's going to cause a psychological effect where we stop and think, what's going to happen if we do this? Where without the cameras, people are less likely to feel that micro error. They're just going to go after the dopamine. So that's the problem with people, is that, like me, for instance, I don't see the value in money. When I look at things around me, I don't see value. When I go to a yard sale, I don't see value. I see cheap. I see things that could be useful to me, and I don't see value. I don't look at something and say, oh, I think that should be $5. Otherwise I'd be a damn master seller. So, but I've noticed when in my younger days, I would see a way to get dopamine, and let me tell you, I would plan over days. And somehow I always made it happen. I didn't understand how I made it happen. I just understood I was making it happen. And then finding out about imagination, it's like, now I see why I was such a good planner, because I was able to imagine, okay, I can set this up, and it'll all work out this way. Eventually, I just got to be patient. If I set up a certain time and a window, then that's just going to cause me to get frustrated, and then everything falls apart. So, yeah, so the problem is, when we want dopamine, we're willing to plan.